Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's NEDA Connections. It's my honor to introduce today's guest, Jennifer Rollin, who will be talking about coping with an eating disorder and/or maintaining recovery during COVID-19. As a reminder, this video and all future NEDA Connections will be archived and accessible after our live sessions. Jennifer Rollin is a therapist and founder of the Eating Disorder Center in Rockville, Maryland, an outpatient therapy practice that provides virtual therapy in California, New York, and Maryland, as well as recovery coaching worldwide. Jennifer has spoken about eating disorders on NBC, ABC, Fox, and PBS, and at national conferences, colleges, and therapy centers. She has written about eating disorders for the Huffington Post and Psychology Today. Jennifer has been named as one of the top eating disorder experts in the country by Balance Eating Disorder Treatment Center. So welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us today. So last week we shared one of your posts that you made about COVID-19. You've had some really great social media posts on this topic. So I was wondering if you could kick us off with explaining kind of your inspiration behind that post and all other relevant posts, and feel free to dive into it.
Sure. So my inspiration was, I debated, should I post regular recovery content? Should I talk about the coronavirus? Because I know there's a lot of anxiety around it. But I think the reality is that the coronavirus is really impacting people. I think it's causing a lot of anxiety for people in general. But my inspiration behind the post was, I think, especially for folks with eating disorders, it's creating a lot of issues, from the memes about weight gain, which are ridiculous, and the daily workouts, and, people hoarding food at the grocery store. And then, I've had clients talk about how they're now home and they're around food constantly. So I think it's just such a triggering time, and it's so important for us to provide as many resources as possible, especially because I think people feel really isolated right now because they're in their homes, essentially. And we know that eating disorders love isolation to spread. So it's kind of, it's like the perfect storm of factors, basically, for people to be very triggered. So I just wanted to kind of go through this post and extrapolate on some of the points, which I thought could be helpful. So point one is that packaged and frozen meals can be part of a healthy diet, and there's no need to fear them. I think there's a lot of fear mongering in diet culture around saying, like, shop the periphery of the grocery store and all these diet culture rules, whereas the reality is that myself and many dietitians as well eat packaged and frozen meals all the time on a regular basis. And especially now, just when you think about sustaining yourself during a quarantine, it's far healthier to have a bunch of pasta, which is actually what I went out and bought, than to have like a bunch of kale. Like, which one is going to sustain you in the long term? And again, pasta and kale are both part of a healthy diet, right? Nothing wrong with either one, but it is okay to lean more heavily towards those nutrient-dense foods right now. So that's fine. I also wanted to talk about how it's pro-recovery to make sure you have enough food in your house right now that can sustain you for a while, and to plan around that. But I also want to acknowledge there's privilege in that some people live with food insecurity, right? And they can't have food in their house. So along that note, I know that scarcity is very triggering for people in recovery. So going to the grocery store, seeing empty shelves of food, thinking, oh my gosh, like, what if we run out of things? That can trigger people with restriction of, well, I should try to eat less to quote unquote conserve food, because eating disorders will jump on whatever it is, keep themselves alive. And then that can also lead to binging, right, and compulsive eating, because the thought is, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to get pie, next week, so I better eat all the pie right now. And so my skill for that, among others, would be DBT, checking the facts. So let's look at, is this objective scarcity or is this subjective scarcity, okay? So I don't want to minimize the reality that for some people struggling with poverty, food insecurity, that might be a scarce resource. And I think that is a different conversation than somebody who's dealing with anxiety, which again is, I don't want to say it's completely illogical, it's valid. I think other people in the world are afraid of that too. And let's check the facts. Like, for instance, where I live in Maryland, it might be different elsewhere. I can go to the grocery store right across the street, and yeah, people are hoarding the toilet paper there, but I can go and get food if I need to get food, right? So not letting your eating disorder use that as a reason to turn to behaviors, letting yourself check the facts. Is this objective or subjective scarcity? And even if I'm experiencing true scarcity, reminding yourself, for many folks, this is temporary, right? Like, the food is going to be available again. This is not going to last forever, I think is really important. And also normalizing that, it's also okay to eat emotionally. I just want to point that out too, that eating is inherently emotional. Otherwise, we wouldn't have cupcakes at birthday parties. It's not simply like the hunger and fullness diet. We can only eat when we're hungry. Eating is cultural, right? Like, it's how we celebrate things sometimes. So I definitely have clients who are like, oh my gosh, I'm definitely eating more and I'm moving less and having a lot of anxiety around that. And again, just remembering that, I guess a few things on that, one, emotional eating is okay, and it's part of like a healthy life, and that it's okay to want to eat comfort foods when you're feeling stressed. That's not bad. And if turning to food to numb out is the only tool in your toolbox, looking at like, how can I expand that tool? What are the needs that I'm trying to get met? So for instance, a client this week talked about feeling really lonely and isolated. And so we talked about how it's okay to turn to food for comfort. You're not bad or wrong. You don't have to shame yourself. And can we look at how can you get that need met in other ways, right? So can we challenge you to reach out to a friend one time a week on the phone? And obviously I know, I'm not necessarily speaking to binging because I know that's very uncomfortable mentally and physically. But again, I just want to say that shaming yourself for using any eating disorder behavior is never really helpful. So even if you are turning to binging or to restricting or to whatever it is, recognizing that at the end of the day, that's a resilient coping strategy that you're using to try to get through whatever you're getting through, and reaching out for support so that people can give you additional resources and other coping tools. So that dialectic between recognizing you're doing the best you can to cope right now and having compassion for yourself, and then also recognizing that there are other strategies that you can use. Okay, and then I talked about some other points here, but rather than read these out, I wanted to address another point that was brought up, and I know many people are struggling with the gyms being closed, which I'm not going to lie, I think some of us eating disorder therapists are happy that people are being forced to take a break. But gyms being closed and people being more sedentary, coupled with more food available, is leading to a lot of feelings of shame and guilt, I think, for people around continuing to nourish their bodies. And eating disorders, again, will latch onto anything, especially right now when things feel so uncertain and anxiety-provoking. Eating disorders love to swoop in and say, I'll help you to feel more in control, which we all know is not the truth, because the more you listen, the more out of control you become. So speaking to that point, first off with the gym, I just want to note that it's healthy and okay to take rest, like to allow yourself to rest, to not move, and to take time off from the gym. That's perfectly fine. And if that's something you're struggling with, that's probably a sign that this was a necessary step for you in your recovery, because we want to have some flexibility around movement. And so if your treatment team is telling you not to exercise, then please don't exercise. If you're medically compromised, please don't exercise. If you're at a place where you can listen to your body and move in a way that feels joyful, then that's fine. And I would encourage you to explore things you can do. So this morning I listened to pump up music and danced to like a song. That's what I did to move my body. And that's perfectly fine, and that's one way to explore joyful movement. But again, that's not a mandate, and you don't have to do any of these like 30-day workout ridiculous things online.
Right. I've been seeing a lot with people kind of trying to reinstate New Year's resolutions, which we discussed how that's an issue to begin with every January. And then there's a lot of pressure, like this is your new start, new beginning, and that can be really harmful for people that are struggling or in recovery.
Right. I went on TikTok the other day. I don't have an account, but just for fun because I was bored. And I was so surprised. I was looking at the hashtag like quarantine, happy at home or whatever. And it was so many workout like joking workout videos even, but that really promoted this unhealthy obsession with fitness. So again, reminding yourself, like, giving yourself grace that you don't need to be trying to build some crazy unattainable body that's going to make you miserable and obsessed with food and working out. And you also don't have to be productive like 100% of the time. Like, this is a very stressful, chaotic time, and it's okay to be kind to yourself. And then the last point, because I'm sure I've already talked over my time, feel free to cut me off whenever, is
Great.
talking about, in relation to movement, this idea of, if I'm moving less, then I need to eat less, and people's eating disorders kind of, grasping onto that as a reason to restrict. I've been hearing that a lot with clients for sure. So first off, recognizing that we all have something called the basal metabolic rate, which is, obviously I'm not going to talk any numbers. I don't even know what that is. It's different for everyone, but that's the energy that your body needs if you're in a coma on an IV drip. Like, that's just to sustain your body. Anything beyond that requires additional energy. So even just like getting up and down, loading the dishes, like, these are all activities of daily movement that require energy. And then we also have to remember that our brain, so rewinding, our body runs on glucose. All food turns into glucose, and carbohydrates are the most easily converted to glucose, which is why we need a lot of them, despite what diet culture says. Our brain is the organ that requires the most glucose, about 20% of the glucose converted to energy. So our brains are like a very hungry, active organ, and when you're restricting, you're starving your brain too. So ultimately, exercise is really only a drop in a bucket when it comes to overall metabolic health, and our bodies need energy, and they need a lot more energy than you've been told by diet culture and your eating disorder. So at the end of the day, energy needs are not going to change that much. And I would also argue that all of the stress and mental energy that you're putting into coping with this pandemic are also accelerating your energy needs as well. And not to mention, we really don't want to be restricting or starving any part of our body, but particularly our brain. We really need that. I mean, we need all our organs, but we want to be able to think clearly, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting just as much nourishment as we got before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for expanding on that. I'm taking a look to see in the comments section if there's any questions that have appeared. So because we are live right now, for folks that are watching at home, feel free to ask some questions. And if we can't get to them now, we will address them either in a blog post or in a future NEDA Connections. So people, also the gym has been a big one. And we asked on Instagram stories yesterday what people wanted to know, and there was a lot of themes, which you did cover, but about people who are worried that they're eating too much, and then people who are worried that they're not eating enough, and kind of that balance in between. So I'm wondering if, you talked about emotional eating, but if there's anything else that you want to expand on that.
Sure. So I think having a loose structure, not a rigid structure, can be helpful. So generally the rule of thumb is trying to get 3 meals, 3 snacks, right? But of course that can be more. I often eat way more than 3 snacks a day. That would be the bare minimum. So sticking to some structure could be good. I also think when it comes to binge eating, there's a few specific triggers that we want to kind of address right now. Can I run through the 3 really quickly?
Absolutely, yeah.
So because I know we talked a little bit about restriction and emotional eating, binge eating, there are 3 main triggers for that, and they're going to be heightened right now because of the pandemic and because of food scarcity and everything happening. So the first trigger is restriction. So that could be physical restriction of, I'm not eating enough for my energy needs. I'm trying to be good during the day, so I'm following some kind of diet. And that could also be emotional restriction. So telling yourself, oh, like I can eat, like eating adequately, eating enough, but not letting yourself have a certain food. So saying, I don't eat X, Y, Z. Or eating the thing and then saying, oh my gosh, I knew I couldn't have this in the house because I just eat all of it. So I'm going to throw them out tomorrow. And then what are you going to do? You're probably going to eat the whole bag. And the example I would give around restriction really quickly is what's happening with toilet paper. So when we say that something is off limits or scarce, the natural human tendency is to hoard it, right? So our brains do the same thing with food. And that's why everyone's hoarding toilet paper, even though there's no real reason to be doing it, just because it's scarce. And so again, that's just like human psychology. And then point two is habituation. This is for any eating disorder behavior. Sometimes we get, like if anyone's ever driven somewhere and you have been there a million times and you don't pay attention, like you know the route so well, that's like that automatic part of our brain that's kind of kicked into autopilot. And sometimes for people with eating disorders, binging or restricting or purging or whatever it is can become an automatic behavior where there's no trigger. I wake up, I do this behavior, right? And so that can definitely come up. And then point three is emotional factors. And right now is a very stressful time. Again, I think there's a climate of anxiety everywhere. So especially for people with eating disorders, often sometimes the way they cope is turning to behaviors. So again, when it comes to binging, asking yourself, first off, being kind to yourself that it's a resilient coping strategy right now. And secondly, asking yourself, what need am I trying to get met? What am I trying to feel or not feel by turning to food? And if it's a valid, healthy need, like I want to feel comforted, thinking about other ways that you can get that need met. And overall, throughout this, with any eating disorder behavior, trying to look at those urges, an increase in urges or thoughts, as a signal of something to pay attention to rather than something that you need to follow.
Yeah, all really, really great advice. Thank you so much. So there's some comments that have come through. A lot of people are talking about like the lack of structure and how that has also been a trigger. So we're going to continue doing these NEDA chats or NEDA check-ins, connections, all the above. And, we'll be addressing these as the days go by. And I wanted to thank you so much, Jennifer, for being our first guest for NEDA Connections, and everyone watching at home. Thank you so much. We will be coming to you tomorrow live to discuss the NEDA Walks program and our upcoming virtual walks. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.